What's up everybody, welcome to Coding with Chaim. In this week's video we're going to build a simple chat application using Socket.io and we're going to be building it in React. So just to kind of give you a bit of a demonstration of what we're going to build, I actually have two windows open on screen. And so the idea basically is that we're going to actually be able to chat with each other from sort of one window to the other, just like a regular chat application would work. So if I come to this application here, or to this window here, I go ahead and say hi. You can see here that it comes up from this side and it's like pink indicating that I'm the sender. Then it comes up to the other user, sort of like grayed out, indicating that it's this sort of like from the other person, from like your partner. Then you come back in here to the other window, you say, hey, hit send. Now you're the sender here, and here you're the kind of the receiver. And as you can see, all this just kind of happens in real time. We're basically chatting from one window to the other. And so in order to achieve that, we're basically using Socket.io. So kind of the focus of this video is to really sort of dive a little bit more, because I actually talked about Socket.io in my last video where I talked about building a WebRTC video chat application. If you missed that, you can definitely find a link down to that in the description box below. I figured this video we're going to keep it more simple, just talk about a simple chat application using Socket.io so that I can highlight more about how Socket.io actually works. Also a little bit different this week is I'm actually going to start building the project from scratch as opposed to like already having like a pre-built template. You can literally follow along with me every single step of the way if you want to, or alternatively you'll also find all the final code to the end result down in the description box. So therefore if you don't want to follow along, you just want to kind of see the end result code, you can do that as well. So let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is create a new folder for our application. So we're going to head on over to Coding with Chaim, Projects, Make Der Chat App. Now let's go ahead and into the chat app. Now we're going to say yarn init-y, and all that really does is it creates a package of JSON. The -y flag pretty much just accepts all the default answers to all the questions that you typically get asked when you're creating a new package of JSON. Now let's open up a new tab. Actually, not yet. So first, let's go ahead and say git init. So now this is going to be a Git repository. Now let's use npx to create a new React project in a folder called client. So effectively, the sort of structure is going to be we basically have this sort of root directory that's going to sort of serve as the backend. And then within that, we're going to have a folder called client that's going to be our React application, which was bootstrapped using Create React App. Okay, so now that that's done, we can come over here. We can go to chat app, go to client. So now this tab here will basically serve as the backend terminal. And this here will serve as the sort of client-side terminal because this is open into the root directory and this is opened up into client. Now we need to install some dependencies. We're going to install Express and Socket.io for the backend. And then for the front end, we're going to install styled components and Socket.io client. So Socket.io on the server basically is just Socket.io. That basically handles the server-side connection part of it. And if from your client-side application, you want to basically connect to that server, you install Socket.io client. That's basically the idea. Okay, so now let's go ahead and create a file called server.js. And let's do code. Open up the editor, and let's start writing some code. Okay, so as you can see, the basic structure that we have is we have the client folder, which as I mentioned is our React application, which was bootstrapped using Create React App. We have our backends package of JSON. We have our basic server.js where our simple server code is going to live, and that's pretty much all there is to it. So let's start writing some code. The first thing we need to do is, of course, import Express. Next, we need to import the built-in node module called HTTP. So we're going to say const HTTP is equal require HTTP. Now we're going to create an app instance of this Express constructor. It's not really a constructor. Now let's go ahead and create a server. So we're going to say const server is equal to http.createServer, passing in our Express app. Now we're going to actually import socket. So we're going to say const socket is equal to require socket.io. Now we're going to actually create an instance of IO by saying const IO is equal to socket, passing in our server that we just created. Finally, the last thing we need to do is we just need to say server.listen, and we'll just go ahead and say that this will listen on port 8000. Server is running on port 8000. Okay, great. So this is the sort of basic setup that you need in order to actually start using Socket.io within your application. Now, basically, the way that Socket.io works is it's really all very much event driven. So given a certain event, you kind of get some kind of a callback. That callback can receive some arguments. You can then emit events back out to the client, and then the client can listen on those events. And so the basic idea here is that typically speaking, whenever you have like server to client communication, it's typically very much like pull and there's no pushing involved. And what that means is typically the client is the one that's always pulling data from the server. The server doesn't really have a way to kind of push data out to the client. The client is always pulling from the server. So with Socket.io, or typically, or what, real-time connections using sockets in general, what that allows us to do in Socket.io is really just kind of a library that makes all of that easier for us. So the basic idea of WebSockets is the fact that now we sort of have like this sort of two-way communication that kind of exists between the client and the server. The client can actually pull data from the server, but just the same, the server can actually go ahead and push data to the client. And in return, the client can also then go ahead and push data back to the server. And so the way that this sort of pushing mechanism works, it's all very much event-driven, as we're pretty much going to see in just a second. So the first event that always happens is going to be io.on. So if you have like a new connection, right? So what this gets is it gets a callback that receives a socket as an argument. This socket represents an individual socket connection for an individual user that just connected, right? So now, for instance, on the socket, I now have different events. I can go ahead and say socket.emit, or I can listen to specific events by saying socket.on, right? Now, the thing that we want to do first, right off the bat, one of the things that we're going to want to do, which will be necessary for our client code, we're going to want to emit an event called your_id. Now, here, the first argument is basically whatever the event you want to call. In other words, it can literally just be any string, any arbitrary string. That's going to represent the event that you're emitting, that your client then needs to sort of listen out for, that you can actually have that communication. And then what we're going to do is whenever this event is emitted, we're basically going to go ahead and send the socket.id. So each socket that gets created from the connection event has a unique ID that gets created, it gets attached to that particular socket. And so what we want to do is we basically want to know who we are. So therefore we know whether we're the sender or we're the receiver in the client-side code, as you've seen before in my demo. And so the way that we're going to do this is when a person actually connects, the server will then go ahead and send off to the client saying, hey, this is your ID, which you can then go ahead and store in state or something like that. Another event that we're going to have is going to be socket.on send message. So every single time the user tries to send a message to another user, they're going to emit the send message event, passing in this body. This body will basically be an object that's going to, once we get to the client-side code, you'll actually see this happen. But this is basically going to be an object that's going to contain the actual message text, and then the ID of who was the sender. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say io.emit. Now notice over here, I'm not saying socket.emit, I'm actually saying io.emit. And the difference there now is that socket.emit actually emits only to the actual socket. So in other words, the socket that called the emit, only that particular event, only that particular socket will actually receive the event that has been sent out. But here, what I'm actually trying to do is I'm actually trying to send out the event to all the people that were connected. Because basically what we're going to have is really two people that are connected. And when one person sends the message, I want both of them to kind of get notified that the message was sent so they can get displayed to both users at the same time from the server. And so therefore I'm using io.emit, which basically says all the clients that are connected should get this event. And then the name of the event is going to be message. And then the actual data that's going to get sent will be this very same body that was just received from the send message event. So in other words, the server listens out for socket.on send message and receives this body, which again contains the text and the ID. And then the socket.io server will basically send back to all connected clients. It'll emit an event called message, and it'll send back the very same body that it just received, and then the client can kind of do everything that it needs to do with it. And as it turns out, this is all the actual necessary code that we need for the client or for the server to work. And now we can kind of start moving on to the client where most of the actual work will take place. So the first thing we need to do is actually go to the package.json of the client. You just create a proxy. This will allow a Webpack Dev server to simply proxy the request from our client straight down to the server. This will help us not have to worry about cores. And so we just say http://localhost port 8000, which is what our server is listening on. And so effectively every request that's going to sort of get initiated by the client, in our case, the only request that's really going to happen is a request to connect to the server via WebSocket connection. That request will just be able to go just directly to, slash the root URL. We don't have to actually put the entire base URL into it, because by us putting that here in the proxy in the package.json Webpack Dev server, will automatically proxy that off to the client or to the server. So once that's out of the way, now we can actually go to app.js and we can start building out the client-side code. So we're going to say import React from React. Now we're also going to need a few hooks. So we're going to need use state. We are going to need use effect, and we're going to need use ref. Now let's import styled from styled components. Now for all the CSS stuff that I've already done within the sample, I'm just going to copy all that code. There's no need for me to actually go through writing all that code over here. It's going to get a little boring. You'll have it in the final project that we built. So therefore, if you want to actually look at what I did, you can take a look at it there. But basically, I'm just using styled components to just build up a whole bunch of components that we're going to use to actually have our chat application actually styled. And the one other thing we need to import is going to be IO from socket.io client right over there. Okay, great. Now let's actually start building the application. So we're going to come down over here. We're going to say const app is equal to a stateless functional component. Export default app. Okay, so now we need to actually set up some basic state that this particular component is going to keep track of. The first one is going to be your ID, and then we're going to have a method for it to set your ID. Use state just empty. We're also going to have an array of messages, and then we're going to have a method to set the messages. So just start as an empty array. And then we're also going to have the individual message that's going to sort of be tied to the message box where you're actually typing in your individual message. And then we're going to have a method for that as well to update that message. And then this will just start out as an empty string. Okay. Now we need to basically create a ref. So we're going to call this socket ref, const socket ref is equal to use ref. So now we're going to actually define our use effect. So we're going to say socket ref dot current is equal to io.connect to just slash. Now typically here you would have, you probably would have needed to do something like http://localhost yada yada yada. But since I've actually set up the proxy in my package.json to simply go to localhost 8000, it's now enough for me to simply just say go to like slash and just go to the root URL. At that point, you're going to establish a connection with our server, and now you actually have a proper socket connection between client and server. Okay, good. So now what we can start doing is we can actually start setting up some event handlers for that this socket will listen out on. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to listen out for the event of when we're actually connecting, and then therefore in return we're going to get our own ID sent back to us from the server to the client so that the client can keep track of who we are. So we're going to say socket ref.current.on on the event of your ID, you will receive the ID sent to you from the server, and then you can basically just say set your ID, passing in ID, just like that. So again, it's all very much event based, right? So we're saying that we're going to be listening out for this particular event. When this event happens, this callback function is going to get called, and in this callback function, the server will actually pass this ID as an argument, which we can then use to set for ourselves. So again, I just keep reiterating this again because this is probably one of the most important points to really understand about Socket.io is that it is all event driven. The client can either listen to events, the server can listen to events, they can both listen to events, and then those events that they're listening on kind of get emitted by the other one. So the server has now effectively emitted this event your ID, which we are now listening on based on the on method. And in turn, as you're soon going to see, the client is actually going to emit an event called send message, which the server listens out for on send message, and then the server then sends back another event called message, which we then be able to listen out for right over here, which I'm actually going to do right now. We're going to say socket ref.current.on message, right? So in other words, whenever the client is sending an event back to the server saying send message, the server responds to that with the actual message event, which this actually sends in the message body, right? And so now we can actually go ahead and set the received message. We can sort of append that to the array of messages that we already have. And so for that, let's just go ahead and create a simple function right over here. We're just going to go ahead and say function received message. This takes in a message. And then all this is really going to do is it's going to go ahead and say set messages. Now in this case, it's actually going to be important to use the functional set state because we basically we're trying to append to an existing array. So we want to make sure that the array already has the old state. So we're going to go ahead and say old messages. And then we're basically just going to do ... old messages, and then the new message that we are now getting in. And so now we're going to call this from the event handler right over here. So we're just going to go ahead and say received messages, passing in this message, right? So the flow again is basically going to be, we are going to send the message, and then in turn the server will then listen out for the send message event receiving this body. It'll then emit back out an event called message back to the client. The client will then listen to that message right over here. It'll receive this new message object, send it into this received message function, which will then just simply append it to state. Okay, and then finally the last thing we need to do is actually, before we start getting to the actual JSX, we need to go ahead and create a function. We're actually going to go ahead and send the message. So we're going to say send. Actually, this is not the last thing. This is the second to last thing. We just need to create the function to send the message. And then we're also going to have to create the function that we're going to sort of attach as the change handler to the text area, so that therefore we can actually have controlled state. So as the user types, we can populate this individual message proper on state right over there. So this is going to be send message, which will take in an E. We'll just say e.prevent default so that the form does not submit itself, right? Because this is going to be instead of a form. Create a message object. Okay, so the object will basically have body. This will be the actual text. So that's going to be pointing to message, which is going to come from state. And then the ID is going to be your ID because you're the one sending. So this is going to be your ID. And that's how we're going to know how to render it, whether we're rendering your ID or someone else's ID. Or in other words, if we're rendering your message or the person who you're talking to, if we're rendering their messages. Now we're going to take the set message function that we have from state to kind of clear the text area back out. We're going to set that back to an empty string. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and say socket ref .current .emit. Going to go ahead and emit an event called send message, and it's going to send this message object down to the server, and then the server will then respond back with the message event, which will then get sent back into state. And then finally, the last thing we need to do is go ahead and create the handle change right over here. So we're just going to go ahead and say function handle change, and then we're just going to go ahead and say, I should still just have this in my clipboard. So we're going to say set message e.target .value. Okay, great. So now we can actually start working on the JSX. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to render the page component. This will basically be the sort of all-encompassing component. Then we render the container, which is pretty much going to house our actual messages, right? And so now given the fact that this is the one that's actually going to be housing our actual messages, this is where we're going to have to iterate over our messages array and then use some kind of logic to determine whether we're showing our message or if we're showing our partner's message. So we're going to go ahead and say messages.map. So we're going to take a message object and then the index so that therefore I can use it as a key. And now we're going to say if message.id is equal to your ID, right? Then you're basically going to go ahead and return myRow, a myRow component. Again, if you want to see what all this looks like, how what the CSS for all of these components are, you can basically just take a look at all the style components that I've created right over there. So the myRow component then will render a myMessage component. Now let's just add the key. So the key will be equal to the index. And then right over here, we're just going to go ahead and say message.body. This is the actual text of the message, message.body. Okay, so this assumes that the IDs actually matched up, which means that you were in fact the sender of this message. Otherwise, what you can then do is just go ahead and say return. Now we're going to go ahead and render a partner row. We're going to set the key to be equal to the index again, and then we're going to render a partner message, and inside the partner message we're just once again going to go ahead and render message.body. Okay, so that basically takes care of our container, which is what's going to house the actual messages. Now we can go ahead and render the form. So the form will basically have an onSubmit. This onSubmit will basically call the send message function that we have. So every time we try to submit, or in other words, we're going to click the button, it'll go ahead and call the send message, which will take our message and actually send it down to the server, emit that event. Here we're going to render the text area, which is where you're going to type your message. So value will be equal to message. On change will be equal to handle change. And finally, a placeholder will just be equal to, say, something. Okay, great. And then finally, the last thing that we need, we're just going to go ahead and render the button. Just go ahead and hit send. Okay, so that basically takes care of everything. So let's just go ahead and run the app and see if we've made any mistakes or if it actually works. So in the backend, all we need to do is just do node server.js. That'll open it up to port 8000. In the client, we're just going to go ahead and say yarn start. All right, so we seem to have some sort of little bug right over here. Okay, I didn't put the button inside the form. The button is supposed to be in the form, small mistake. And now it should render correctly. Okay, there we go. So now it's actually rendering correctly. Great. Okay, so now we'll bring up both apps. Let's see if this works. So come over here to the first browser. We say hi. You see that it shows up right over there. Come back here. We say hey. And we see that it shows up over there. So as you can see, we've effectively just built a simple React application that is effectively a chat app using Socket.io. Well, that does it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it useful. If you did, please drop a like, subscribe, and I'll be back next week with another video.